My name is Thomas Lux, and I am your host for this evening, for this poetry reading, part of poetry at Tech. We have two terrific poets here tonight. They're going to read for about 25 minutes each. We know that some of you guys probably have labs at 9 o'clock or so the whole program shouldn't last more than an hour. I'm going to introduce both of the poets right now and briefly to minimize my time up here. And then if you'll hold your seats for just 1 minute after both poets have read, I get up and thank some people. Tonight, Linda Gregerson and Christopher Howell, as I said. Linda's going to read first. She's a professor at the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor, has been a professor there for a long time. She originally was a Miltonist and is as well as a poet, now teaches primarily in the creative writing program at Michigan. And I was just telling her earlier, we have next year, I believe, at least a couple sections of freshmen, our equivalent of freshman comp classes, are going to be reading Paradise Lost. There's going to be 60 or 70 Georgia Tech students spending at least a whole semester, maybe a whole year, reading Paradise Lost. That's a really unique thing for any university, but maybe even a little more so here at Georgia Tech. Linda's known for her graceful and concise and uniquely musical poems. She has that rare ability to write a poem that captures and articulates how the mind actually moves, the way thought moves, the way people think. That's a lot harder to do than it might sound, certainly to do it well as she does. She knows how to find the metaphysical in the concrete, and the concrete and in the metaphysical. And trust me, folks, that's really hard to do as well. She's published many books. This is her most recent book, New and Selected Poems Prodigal. There should be a copy for everybody out there for free, or for Christopher's selected poems, not this one, but the poets will hang around for a while later after the reading and sign books for you. Wouldn't pass that, but everybody gets a free book. That's part of the deal here. Christopher Howell, who will read second, is a deep strain of empathy and extraordinary telescopic eyes that this poet has for poems that poetry can be found in anywhere, everyday life and lives. He's not the first poet to do that, of course, to find poetry in virtually everywhere, anywhere, but he does it as well as anybody that I've ever read. It's a kind of huge heart on top of a sense of deep noticing. And he has also incredible, as both of these poets do, tremendous prosodic skills. Christopher lives in Spokane, Washington, and he teaches at the University of Eastern Washington. Now, at the last reading, I also talked about service to the art form. Both of these poets have not only given us their poems for many years, they're really good poems, but they've served the art form in other ways, as teachers, as translators, as editors. Christopher's edited for over 40 years, Link's House Press, first-rate independent press. Reviewers and essayists, they have served the art form. Please welcome first Linda Gregerson.
Thank you, Tom, and kindest thanks for having me here. I'm really honored to be here. Thank you all for coming, spending part of your evening with us, and I'm very honored to be reading with Christopher. Right, I'm going to watch the time too. I discovered when my local actually existing opossum made her way into my poem that I didn't know as much as I wanted to about opossums, so I looked up some things and discovered stunningly a couple of things. One, that the average number of teats that the American opossum has is 13. Go figure. I mean, it's 13. Sometimes they have one extra, sometimes one fewer. But 13, I thought that's an allegory right there. So I think this is something of an American poem. It's called Sweet. Linda, said my mother when the buildings fell. Before, you understand, we knew a thing about the reasons or the ways and means, while we were still dumbfounded, still bereft of likely narratives. We cannot continue to live in a world where we have so much and other people have so little. Sweet, he said. Your mother's wrong, but sweet. The world has never self-corrected. You Americans break my heart. Our possum, she must be hungry or she wouldn't venture out in so much daylight, has found a way to maneuver on top of the snow. Thin crust. Sometimes her foot breaks through. The edge of the woods for safety, or for safety's hopeful look-alike. Delphus, doubled wound, which is to say our one marsupial. The shelter, then the early birth, then shelter perforce again. Virginiana, for the place. The place for a queen, supposed to have her maidenhead. He was clever. He had moved among the powerful. Our possum possessed of 13 teats, or so my book informs me, quite a ready-made republic, guides her blind and all but embryonic young to their pouch by licking a path from the birth canal. Resourceful, no, requiring commendable limberness, as does the part I've seen, the part where she ferries the juveniles on her back, another pair of eyes above her shoulder. Sweet. The place construed as yet to be written upon by us. And many lost, as when their numbers exceed the sources of milk, or when the weaker ones fall by the wayside. There are principles at work, no doubt. Beholding a world of harm, the mind will apprehend some bringer of harm, some cause or course that might have been otherwise had we possessed the wit to see, or ruthlessness, or heart. My mother's mistake, if that's the best the world as we've made it can make of her, hasn't much altered with better advice. Its wholly premise, rather like the crusted snow. I didn't quite realize when I was selecting these poems how very American I had made this in this this first part. Here we are in the midst of an election campaign, rather different than the present one. This is called this selvage. Do you know what selvage is? No, seamstress. All right, seamstresses. Selvage is that margin on fabric when you buy fabric by the bolt. It's that part that is woven so it doesn't unravel. I remember, setting on the kitchen table my McCall's patterns, that tissue paper on fabric, and having to make sure that the pieces didn't go into the selvage, because you can't have that show on the garment you're making anyway. It's about that. It comes from self-edge, actually. And it's about not raveling or the selvage one. So Door to door among the shotgun shacks in Cullowhee and Waynesville in our cleanest shirts, and ma'am and excuse me were all but second nature now. And this one woman comes to the door. She must have weighed 300 pounds. Would you be willing to tell us who you plan to vote for, we say. And she turns around with Everett, who are we voting for? The black guy, says Everett. The black guy, she says, except that wasn't the language they used. They used the word we've all agreed to banish from even our innermost thoughts, which is when I knew he was going to win. 2. At which point, the speaker discovers, as if the lesson were new, she has told the story at her own expense. Amazing, said my sister's chairman's second wife. To think what you've amounted to, considering where you're from, which she imagined was a compliment. One country, friends, where when we have to go there as depend upon it fat or thin, regenerate or blinkered to the end, we shall, they have to take us in. I saw 3, a river full of geese as I drove home across our one-lane bridge. 400 of them easily, close massed against the current and the bitter wind. Some settled on the ice, and just the few at a time who'd loosen rank to gather again downstream, as if to paraphrase. The fabric, every minute bound by just that pulling out that holds the raveling together. You were driving all this time, said Stephen, counting geese, the snow falling into the river. No, the river about to give itself over to ice. I'd stopped. Their wingspans, had they not been taking shelter here, as wide as we are tall. Stephen is my husband, who has noted with some wryness that his chief appearances in my poems have to do with making just such comments or fixing the plumbing. He does other things in the world as well. He's quite a wonderful Shakespeare scholar. But that doesn't emerge, that part of him doesn't emerge a lot in my poems. Lately I've taken to guessing a lot, chiefly in the auditory realm, where I am less and less acute, which leads to masses of amusement on the home front, Mom in orbit, and what must by now approximate a 20-point drop in the quotient we call IQ. Endearing's not my strong suit, but I'll take what I can get. 40% is what I thought I heard tonight, but surely that's not possible. All that ozone lost, a single Arctic winter. I had thought those were the healing months for snowpack, but it seems the atmospheric ice does something with the sunlight that's inimical, unfriendly in the long run to the cold, so cold against itself, which we have done. Which, if I may compare great things to small, is what my doctor thinks may be the trouble with my ear. Byblow of the larger chronic proneness to construe what might have been benign as something to be fought. So Malleus, Stapes, hammer and tongs. I've seen the enemy and he, etc. On an island in the Tiri Fjord in Norway several days ago, a man who said he'd come for their protection, and what's worse, who with a not before unheard of in the history of the world excuse for logic, really thought that was the case, hunted down and shot as many people as he could. Obsession at the barricades, which when it goes wrong in the body, we label as autoimmune. The body ingenious, body so resilient, he chose hollow point bullets to better his odds. At least, said the girl in the newscast, he was one of us, and everyone knew exactly what she meant. this next poem, I'm rarely able to write poems that sit like that on the page, nice short ones. I wrote this as emulation of a fragment. It was the only way I could trick myself into staying concise. And that fragment is perhaps the most famous one in all of poetry. It's one of Sappho's poems, and it's a love poem. You'll hear, those of you who know that poem, a little bit of the English language translation. When my daughters were in middle school and grade school respectively, we bought them a horse. That horse is now 27 years old and chiefly in retirement, a rather expensive retirement, but he's divine. This is when he was younger. Narrow flame, dark still, 12 degrees below freezing. Tremor along the elegant, injured, right front leg of the gelding on the cross ties. Kneeling girl. The undersong of waters as she bathes the leg in yet more cold. Tongue is broken. God to me. Her hair the color of winter wheat. I wanted to call this book Sostenuto, which is the title of the next poem, and my editor was horrified. She said, nobody's going to know what that means. Put people off. It's musicians here know what it means. It's from the Italian, and it has to do with, I first encountered it when I was in high school in the choir, and it's when a note is supposed to be sustained, which you can do with an organ without much trouble, but when you rely on human breath, as with a wind instrument or vocal music, it takes a little more doing. Right. Sostenuto. Night. Or what they have of it at altitude like this, and filtered air. What was in my lungs just an hour ago is now in yours. There's only so much air to go around. They're making more people, my father would say, but nobody's making more land. When my daughters were little and played in their bath, they invented a game whose logic largely escaped me, something to do with the disposition of bubbles and plastic ducks, until I asked them what they called it. They were 2 and 4. The game was oil spill. Keeping the ducks alive, I think, was what you were supposed to contrive, as long as you could make it last. Up here, in borrowed air, in borrowed bits of heat, in costly cubic feet of steerage, we're a long-held note, as when the choir would seem to be more than human breath could manage. In the third age, says the story, they divided up the earth, and that was when the goddess turned away from them. I used to take students to London sometimes and take them to the theater, which was a great treat. especially for me. and I took them on a tour a couple of times of the National Theatre on the South Bank. And there are 3 performance spaces there, the largest of which is named for Laurence Olivier, the spectacular 20th century actor who founded the National Theatre and used his leverage to shame the government eventually into building a purpose-built theater. We were told when we were touring in this space that the unusual color in which the seats were upholstered were that unusual color because it was Olivier's favorite. And furthermore, that the name of that color was a word he used in his vocal warm-ups. That color and that word is heliotrope. It's also one of the stories that Ovid retells in the Metamorphoses about, it's a flower that has lots of different blossoms on it, so it's not a single-headed flower, lots of different ones, and they follow the sun as it makes its circuit, hence heliotrope. It's tropic, it follows, loves the sun. Heliotrope, I was his favorite, simply that. And you can see for yourself why it might have been so. The lushest, least likely to weary the eyes of all the serrate wavelengths. Never obvious. My bit of the spectrum unstable somehow in a way that kept bringing him back. Search image on your browser and you'll see what I mean. I've never had the advantage of sculptural beauty as the lily has. I haven't been able to boast that stricture of line, that making no mistakes. God knows I've wished for it, beggars can dream. But no, some neither this nor that turns out to be my sphere. Some manyness rather than singular perfection, which I like to think he thought about. He made this place, they named it for him, and upholstered the seats in heliotrope, whose cluster of vowels and consonants he loved like my blue going violet with touches of gray. The vocal colors warm up nightly before the play. So you see, they were wrong, the ones who called me unrequited. I was in his throat, among the folds and ridges, and beyond them to the very dome upon whose curve the heart resides. Just think what it used to be then, in the hour before they'd let the rest of you in. My many faces toward the sun who spoke, no, sang my name.
It's really nice to be here. And I want to thank Tom and Travis Denton for putting it together, and all of you for showing up. And it's really a pleasure and a privilege to read with Linda. I feel a little bit like a crow following a nightingale, but I'll do my best. I'm going to start with a poem I hadn't planned to read, but since Linda started out reading about possums, I'm going to read this, which is dedicated to my good friend sitting here in the front row. It's called The Ride. You probably don't remember, it was years ago. You and I and Amorosi and David Lyon rode down to Springfield in the back of Tremblay's rattletrap van. You sat with a pint of peach brandy in a bag on your knees and said nothing the whole loud careening way along the back roads to Belchertown. I thought you disdainful of us, maybe, or too drunk to know. We wanted you to speak as we spoke about the evening or the road. or the ghostly broken mill towns we passed through, or anything at all, but you just sat under your lank whitish hair, tippling, not even looking up. When we hit the possum, all its kittens hung from it like a string of bells. Trembly nearly cried, rocking like a bear in the headlight beams, shaking his head above that quivering heap of blood and eyes. You didn't get out with the rest of us to console or lead him back so the journey could go on. When we arrived and piled out to find the appointed room, you said, "It's cold tonight," to no one. And I saw my judgment of you a broken, worried thing, like so much of what we knew then, in those days after the war. You simply hadn't cared to speak. You had your thoughts, and the rest of us were just the rest of us, born together through a single night, no one knowing it would never end and never be the same. No one but you knowing how much the voice can cost, how wrongly it can take you into the path of a transfixing lie, its headlights coming on, monstrous and too beautiful for words.
That wasn't me. That must have been Kodak.
Hey, what?
That was you, dude. Yeah.
Yeah. Desperately composed. I wake on a small raft and see her swimming away with a cat under each arm and wearing the sun like a kind of sombrero. Again, I have not been chosen. What will I drink so far from land? Where will I find flowers enough to keep me breathing what St. Francis called the perfect air, the pneuma of hope's tiny bells announcing the hours of supplication and grace? She is far from me now, a speck rising and dipping on the dazzle, on a glinting of green trumpets that call and call as Mahler drifts past in a cleft-shaped canoe, and I toss him a story in which a man dreams himself beyond thought, beyond the farthest point of land, where what he loves has left him widened and cloudy. The great sky somehow come into his broken-fingered notation, turning slowly all night, lifting as I do, waving to her, imploring the angels to open themselves, tune their instruments, and pretend that he is one of them, or they, more of him than he can count. First touch. After the movie, the garden golf, coffee, and long, soulful walk, after the alternating daisy petals of elation, dejection, elation, we stood in the Klieg lights on her front porch. I could hear through the door the ox-like breathing of her father, poised to fling it wide and pounce. From the roundness of her green eyes, I could tell she heard it too. But inside us, some kind of execution was on the way, and we were its last meal, our mouths beginning to know this and to open slightly and drift toward each other like clouds. We had been kissing for months. This kiss was not that country. This one had nothing to do with gratitude or the sort of evening we had had or expectation or revenge against parents and the church or even curiosity. It was the exclusivity of desire, the dizzy, mutually sudden focus of our young neurons driving us onto a single, unrepeatable moment of physical revelation fused to a steam of lips and tongues and interpenetrating breath. When at last we disengaged from that eternity, still holding me, she turned her back to the door, took my hand, and in a gesture ceremonially exact, placed it upon her breast. She was wearing a bra, a blouse, a sweater, and a coat. She might have been Joan of Arc, arrayed for battle. Nevertheless, the magnitude of this gift surged up my arm and neck and into my hair till I began to lift or faint and felt the moon raking my blood with gems. She drew away, smiled a little, and opened the door. Her father, standing like Stonehenge against the living room light, allowed her in, then shut the whole house hard, the lion-headed brass knocker banging like a gunshot. I moved throbbingly down the steps and headed home. After a block or so, I could walk normally. The softness of her lips and tongue, the roundness and tension beneath my palm as she held it to her, every step brought these, and such a warm loneliness came over me. I thought I would not much mind death then, if gods could die. I walked down Hawthorne Street from 82nd to 89th, through a hall of overhanging trees, through the small kivas of light that fell from the street lamps. Did I continue on Hawthorne to 92nd, or turn left and cross the dark schoolyard? It was a long time ago. Kennedy was president. Vietnam, just a place we sent advisors. Moths were circling in porch lights and dying in ecstasies of brilliance. No one in the world but that one girl knew where I was. A few years ago, I was asked to supply a poem to an anthology of poems about mushrooms. I had no poems about mushrooms, so I had to fall back on experience. And I wrote this. The John Muir who is referred to in this poem is not the John Muir naturalist, but the John Muir author of How to Keep Your Volkswagen Alive, a guide for the complete idiot, which some of you may remember. It's called Letting Things Go. So now I'm thinking about mushrooms, their curious smell and lightness, about the great adventure of not knowing exactly which were poison and which would get you off, like Flash Gordon in a purple car, about how we wandered pastures, plucking and praying for that wild ride that seldom came. And in that connection, I have to think of 1974, Montana Bill and I driving all the way to Manzanillo in a Dodge van to present my manuscript of poems to John Muir Publications at their annual conference and drug fest. After days of negotiation, it was agreed I would read to the 20 or more principal mavens of the group, including Muir himself, and they would decide. We gathered around a huge table out under the stars, and I opened my manuscript. But first, Muir said, we should get into the mood, and began to load his pipe with a weed and psilocybin Mexicana mixture which everyone smoked until their eyes were huge pulsing zeros. Then I read. It was like hollering into a vat of butter, like singing to Martians about the stock exchange. When, after 300 years, I finished, they nodded into themselves, looked around, and went off toward the beach. 2 days later, the managing editor collared me and said, well, they thought I should talk to you because we're about the same height. So, it's like this. We know you're a good poet, and we'd really like to help you out, but you're into holding on to things, and we're into letting things go. A terribly true story. trusting the bees. No matter what I longed for, it seemed the sea was all there was. If you didn't count moon and shark fins in our wake, glittering with phosphorescence like narrow intimations of defeat. Even so, there was no news but the war and unaccented rumors of what women left ashore might choose to do. George's wife rode off on a Harley and never sent even the poisoned Dear George we just knew was coming for us all. But blossom begets blossom, I believed, and any breeze could be a messenger of hope. About my wife, therefore, I venture to suppose, so what if she fertles till her teeth dissolve? So what if I die, and my body, committed to the deep, never knows again the silken suffrage of her skin? Cloud shadow mingled with the bright and salt. The soaring albatross held to its course like St. Brendan, trusting his beads as a kind of chart by which intention grew into the actual new world, forever arrived at and then destroyed. And sometimes I confess I ground my teeth and spat, God help her, when they left me out this tub. And then I thought again, so what? We're all sailing off the edge like towers on a conveyor to the blue glow of snuffed out candle smoke. Have any of us loved enough, if love is all we have? Sometimes when the wind was up and the ship lifting and plunging like the men who were surely sleeping with our wives, I stood rocking on the fantail, tearing official documents into flowers. Pay voucher roses, requisition pinks, leave request lilies fluttered over the rail and sank like votes. Once I tossed a typewriter and got 12 days in the brig. At mast, "What's the matter with you?" the XO asked. "What's wrong with the whole goddamn bunch of you?" Smart ass. I told him it had to do with style, but it didn't. On and on we steamed, Sisyphean, the marriages going down sordidly in flame, grief's aftermath, shrouding the ship like haze above a village, smoldering in rain. What was wrong would have scarred the fish-like stars and turned our decks to soot had it unmasked itself. What was wrong was a Hitler mannequin's design, all of us in rows but drifting, saluting a scrap of cloth, red, white, and blue wreckage behind us everywhere, and the old new world, a navigational distortion found by faith alone, as Luther said about salvation. But we were faithless, as our wives must have known, and dull, almost mean, with the shame of that. Every once in a while, I think I'm through writing about the Vietnam conflict, and here they come again. Some things you just don't really outgrow. You just continue to look at them, and every new perspective gives you a new sort of sense of what you have to say. This poem is called Something to Think About. Last night I dreamed of death, and it wasn't that bad. It was a youngish woman with lacy blonde hair and a lifetime's worth of smiles. "Come here," she said, holding out a wedge of dark ice. "Have a kiss." It tasted like air in the Mount Olivet Lutheran Church when most of the lights were out at a warm and secret hour with no one near. It tasted like ginger lingering in tasted like ginger thinking of an unknown color I found myself becoming. It was not cold at all, and she said, "See?" From another part of my house, a different voice hollered, "It's a trick, she wants to eat your eyes." But I thought, so what? If I'm dying, what will I need them for? And death said again, "Come here," and opened wide her beautiful jaws. All day I have been thinking that this probably accounts for my blindness about blondes. more or less. I think of the red umbrella of the last god, hoping for rain or fire or a see-through blouse drifting in the moonlit trees. I think of him filing his nails with a miniature violin, its music a scratch in the dark ice of midnight cities, heaving in their wired sleep and keeping up the payments. I think of prayer and sacrifice, leaking like fireflies from his hair, from the brittle ends of his wings if he has them, if he hasn't pawned them feather by feather, like an echo eaten by the stones, or a promise lost in space. Out of candles and out of luck, I think he wonders if this is already a kind of afterlife. What's after that? Where do the dead gods go with their loneliness? Would it help to be a woman or a song? I imagine useless juju flitting around him like a whirlwind of confused birds left out of the migration. Surely at last he embraces his empty sleeves and lets go, as the Buddha must have, knowing that even gods are only what they are, and that there is always more or less nothing but to be and begin again. Astronomy lesson. I had dreamed all day of baseball and a girl named Darlene, and therefore stood at the blackboard like a blind conductor, imagining the orchestra as a field it would take years to cross. The teacher loomed over me, gloating, disgusted, had it up to here in her blue cotton dress with its belt of little mother-of-pearl moons I wanted to touch. Near the school day's end, she had suddenly, it seemed to me, shouted, "Christopher, which planet in our solar system is closest to Earth?" Who could know, I thought. Who could know even what it meant to know, when you could call it anything you liked, and looking out the window could imagine yourself there and be back before the end of class, or the end predicted every weekday by that man with the sign who wept as he ran down Hawthorne Street begging us all to repent. And of course I wanted to repent. My lazy and ignorant life, its obvious worthlessness to anyone but my mother, who saw nothing wrong and who would be puzzled again at my having to stay after school, confused and humiliated at the blackboard, writing, "Dreaming makes one stupid," over and over. Slowly, the teacher with her arms crossed, tapping a foot. If only I would pay attention, what would become of me? She was sure she didn't know. Above us the new moon went by, and all the daylight stars telling their stories without a sound, though the man with the sign was listening hard to his own numb heart. And at the blackboard, I fixed on the white curve of the letter S in stupid, like a pathway I could follow out of the den of that Gorgon, who knew everything except that the sun would not like her wearing moons around her waist like that, as though she herself were a planet where no one would ever repent and children were despised. This is kind of like a villanelle, but I kind of screwed up the form, or I insisted I invented my own. So it's sort of like a Howell. It's called Awake at Newport, 4 a.m. The lighthouse lamp goes starry and goes dark. The sea will not forbid itself the shore. Listen, you can hear the dog star bark, louder than it ever barked before. You lie awake and count yourself again and find that more is less and less is more. Where you are is where you've always been. The sea will not forbid itself the shore. What loneliness compels you to arise and touch the broken edges of the dark? Is it greater than the loneliness of skies? Listen, you can hear the dog star bark, louder than it ever barked before. Your life falls into blackness like a spark. The sea will not forbid itself the shore. The lighthouse lamp goes starry and goes dark. I'm going to read 2 more poems. So I say. This is called Love's Last Number. She was 4 years old when she told me the children at her daycare had been arguing over which was greater, infinity, pronounced finity, or the last number. Sometimes we're speechless because we deserve to be. Sometimes love leaps out beyond enumeration or the vast, starry spaces in the skull of time. With a secret, satisfied smile, she said, Jeremy says it's the last number, but we really know it's finity. And now she has gone like a sprite into the genius of her answer, leaping every number, sailing into the endlessness of that smile, and left us plodding knee-deep in starless equations in which x equals loss again and again and again to the nth power. Jesus said our days are numbered. Hermes Trismegistus said numbers were the secret words by which the world and heavens told each other what would ever be. And now we say a thing that matters counts, and when it stops counting, it is dross. We say to measure is to know, and to know is to possess, but love burns without consuming and weighs nothing, like faith, like a fool's precision, or the dream of a memory of a child's face. The 72 names of God, the 10,000 things too, are nothing to the one indivisible life, the sweet and singular falling plum, and the spirit that flies away. I'll close with Homecoming. I put on my good black shoes, my shirt of gray softness that reminds me of luck, and the blue hat given me by a child who left this earth that even her shadow made so beautiful. And then, well, I set out down the clamor of roads and almost by accident onto paths through dense apothecaries of evergreen and fern, and finally to meadows and orchards risen from the dead into a contentment that did not know me and wouldn't take my money or my name. Did I not see I was the same no one who had lived there always and could never return? Did I not perceive the multitudes waving their arms like wind to be known again and gathered like pieces of a god? How many, many years, how much spent blood to unpilgrim ourselves, to stand before an empty house, glistening with the grief of a happy life. Thank you.